What happens when a mafia boss fires the one person his children actually trust? Kang Taewoo ruled Seoul's underworld with absolute authority until his 3 daughters said 7 words that destroyed everything he believed about power. Stephanie Okafor wasn't supposed to matter. She was just the help. But when Taewoo dismissed her in front of his entire household, he thought he was teaching a lesson about respect. Instead, his triplets taught him something far more dangerous, that fear and loyalty are not the same thing. This is the story of a man who controlled an empire but couldn't control the truth. A woman who walked away with her dignity intact. And 3 little girls who understood what their father refused to see. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, stay until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would have done. The silence in Kang Taewoo's dining hall had weight. It pressed against the mahogany walls, settled between the crystal chandeliers, and wrapped around the 23 people gathered in the space like a fist slowly closing. Stephanie Okafor stood at the center of that silence, her uniform pressed, her posture perfect, her dark hands clasped in front of her white apron. She did not shake. She did not cry. She simply stood there, absorbing the words Taewoo had just spoken as if they were nothing more than weather. You're dismissed. Effective immediately. Taewoo's voice carried the kind of authority that made men twice his size lower their eyes. He sat at the head of the long table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his tailored black suit catching the afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Around him, his inner circle shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended to examine their phones. Others stared at their plates. No one looked at Stephanie. Except the triplets. Iron, Soli, and Miru sat in their small chairs near the window, 3 identical pairs of dark eyes fixed on their father. They were 7 years old, dressed in matching navy dresses their grandmother had chosen, their hair pulled back in tight braids Stephanie had woven that morning. They did not move. They did not speak. But they watched everything. Stephanie bowed once, a precise 30-degree angle that revealed nothing of what she felt inside. When she straightened, her gaze met Taewoo's for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to show she wasn't ashamed. Short enough to deny him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Understood, Mr. Kang. Her accent wrapped around the Korean words like fabric around glass, foreign, but unbreakable. She turned and walked toward the door that led to the servants' quarters. Her footsteps were the only sound in the room until Miru's voice cut through the air like a knife. Where is she going? Taewoo didn't look at his daughter. Miru, finish your rice. I asked where she's going. And I said finish your rice. The door closed behind Stephanie with a soft click that felt louder than a gunshot. Taewoo's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. His chief security officer, Juno, cleared his throat from 3 seats down. Sir, should I arrange for the new hire to start tomorrow? Yes. Someone local this time. Of course. Juno's eyes flickered toward the window where the triplets sat. Someone who understands the culture. The words hung in the air with all their ugly implications. Taewoo chose not to correct them. He had made his decision based on principle, he told himself. Stephanie had questioned his judgment in front of the children. She had suggested that leaving the girls in the sitting room during yesterday's business meeting was inappropriate. As if she had any right to determine what was appropriate in his house. Respect required distance. Authority required absolute obedience. These were the rules that had kept him alive in a world where mercy was a luxury and hesitation was death. What Taewoo didn't see was Soli slowly pushing her rice bowl away from her. He didn't notice Iron's fingers curling into fists beneath the table. And he completely missed the way Miru's face transformed from shock to something far colder, calculation. The meal continued. Conversations resumed. Plans were made for the evening's shipment, for next week's negotiations with the Busan faction, for the careful maintenance of an empire built on violence and control. Taewoo listened, contributed, decided. He was good at deciding. It was what made him powerful. By the time the dishes were cleared, he had almost forgotten about the Nigerian woman who had worked in his home for 8 months. Almost. That night, Stephanie packed her belongings in the small room she'd occupied on the 3rd floor of the mansion's east wing. The space was barely larger than a closet, but she had made it hers. A small wooden cross hung above the narrow bed. 3 books in Igbo sat on the nightstand. A photograph of her mother and sisters back in Lagos was tucked into the mirror frame. She folded her clothes with the same precision she brought to everything, each item squared and stacked. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Her hands moved automatically while her mind worked through calculations. She had saved most of her salary. Enough for 2 months' rent in one of the cheaper districts. Enough to eat while she looked for new work. Enough to survive the shame of returning to the Nigerian community in Seoul and admitting she'd been fired. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Stephanie didn't turn around. "Come in." The door cracked open and 3 small figures slipped inside, closing it quietly behind them. The triplets had changed into their pajamas, but none of them looked ready for bed. Miru's jaw was set in that stubborn line that usually preceded trouble. Soli's eyes were red, though she hadn't been crying. Iron simply stared at the half-packed suitcase on the bed as if it were a puzzle she needed to solve. "You're really leaving?" It wasn't a question. Iron spoke the way she did everything, with absolute certainty, as if she'd already calculated every possible outcome. Stephanie sat on the edge of the bed and gestured to the small space beside her. All 3 girls climbed up, arranging themselves in order of birth: Iron, Soli, Miru, the way they always did. "Your father made a decision," Stephanie said quietly. "I have to respect it." "That's stupid." Miru's voice cracked on the last word. "He didn't even give a reason." "He doesn't need to give a reason. It's his house. But it's our home." Soli's whisper carried more weight than a shout. "You're part of our home." Stephanie felt something twist in her chest, but she kept her expression calm. She had learned young that tears were a luxury. Her mother had taught her that before sending her to university. Her sisters had reinforced it when she left Nigeria searching for better opportunities. The world did not reward Black women for their vulnerability. "You'll have a new caretaker," she said instead. "Someone your father trusts more." Iron's head tilted. "He trusted you with us every single day for 8 months. Until yesterday. Yesterday I made a mistake." "No." Iron's voice was flat, factual. "Yesterday you told the truth. Auntie Stephanie, I heard everything you said. You told father it wasn't safe to leave us in the sitting room because those men carry guns and they drink and they get loud. You said children shouldn't be around that. And you were right." Stephanie closed her eyes briefly. The children called her auntie even though she'd never asked them to. It had started with Miru 3 months ago and spread to the others. She'd tried to discourage it, tried to maintain the professional distance that servants were supposed to keep, but the triplets had simply ignored her protests. "Being right doesn't always matter," Stephanie said softly. "Then what does?" Soli asked. The question was so simple, so direct, that Stephanie had no good answer. What could she tell them? That power mattered more than truth? That their father's pride was more important than their safety? That sometimes the world punished you not for being wrong, but for being right too loudly? Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out 3 small leather bracelets she'd been making in her spare time. They were simple things, woven from cords she'd bought at a market in Itaewon. Each one dyed a different color: blue for Iron, white for Soli, red for Miru. "These are for you," she said, fastening one around each small wrist. "In my village, we wear these to remember promises. I want you to promise me something." "What?" Mira touched the red bracelet like it was made of gold. "Promise me you'll always tell the truth, even when it's hard. Even when someone with power tells you to be quiet. Even when speaking costs you something." Stephanie met each girl's eyes in turn. "But be smart about it. Pick your battles. Know the difference between honesty and cruelty. Can you do that?" All 3 nodded solemnly. "Good." Stephanie stood, smoothing down her skirt. "Now go to bed before someone realizes you're here." They left reluctantly, Miru looking back 3 times before the door finally closed. Stephanie listened to their footsteps fade down the hallway, then returned to her packing. She did not let herself cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. The next morning, Stephanie was gone before sunrise. For 3 days, the mansion functioned normally. A new woman arrived, Mrs. Park, a middle-aged Korean with 20 years of domestic service experience. She was efficient, respectful, and completely incapable of connecting with the triplets. Mrs. Park tried. She really did. She brought them snacks they didn't eat. She asked about their day and received one-word answers. She suggested activities that were met with blank stares. By the end of the first week, she was visibly frustrated. "They won't listen to anything I say," she complained to the head housekeeper. "It's like they're doing it on purpose." They were. Miru had started leaving her shoes in the middle of hallways where Mrs. Park would trip over them. Soli had taken to speaking so quietly that Mrs. Park had to ask her to repeat everything 3 times, then claiming she couldn't remember what she'd been saying. And Irene had perfected a look of such innocent confusion that she could derail any instruction simply by asking increasingly complex follow-up questions until Mrs. Park gave up in exhaustion. Taewoo noticed none of this. He was busy managing a territorial dispute in Gangnam, negotiating with suppliers in Incheon, and handling the 1,000 small crises that came with running a criminal empire. His daughters were fed, clothed, and supervised. That was sufficient. Until the dinner. It was a formal affair, the kind Taewoo hosted once a month to maintain relationships with his network. 20 guests gathered around the extended dining table, underbosses, suppliers, a few politicians who'd learned to look the other way for the right price. The triplets were required to attend these dinners, a tradition Taewoo had inherited from his own father. Children should see how power operates, he believed. They should learn early. The girls sat at the far end of the table, dressed in matching navy dresses again, their food barely touched. Mrs. Park hovered nearby, anxiously trying to get them to eat something. The adults paid them no attention, absorbed in their own conversations about territory and money and the careful mathematics of violence. Taewoo was discussing a shipping route with a supplier from Busan when Juno, seated to his right, made an offhand comment. "At least you sorted out that situation with the foreign help." "Bad look, boss. People talk." Taewoo's expression didn't change. It was a personnel decision. Sure. But you know how it is." Juno lowered his voice, though not enough. "These foreign workers, they don't understand hierarchy. Different culture. Can't trust them around family." Several heads nodded around the table. A politician across from them chuckled. "My wife tried hiring a Filipino maid once. Nightmare. They have ideas above their station." "Exactly." Juno reached for his wine glass. "Stick with your own people. Safer that way." The conversation moved on. Taewoo said nothing to correct the assumptions, the casual prejudice that had wrapped itself around his decision like ivy on a wall. He had fired Stephanie because she questioned him, not because of her nationality. The distinction seemed important in his mind, even as he let others draw their own conclusions. At the far end of the table, Miru's fork clattered against her plate. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but something about it cut through the conversation. Heads turned. Mrs. Park reached out to steady the child, but Miru pulled away. "I'm not hungry. Mira, you need to eat something." Mrs. Park's voice carried the strain of a week's worth of battles. "I said I'm not hungry." Taewoo's voice carried down the table. "Miru, eat your food." The 7-year-old looked at her father with an expression that should not have been possible on such a young face. Not anger, not defiance, but something closer to disappointment. "Why?" "Because I told you to." "That's not a reason." The table had gone very quiet. Juno shifted uncomfortably. The politician stopped mid-sip of his wine. This wasn't how children spoke to Kang Taewoo. "Miru." Taewoo's voice dropped into that dangerous register that made grown men straighten in their chairs. "We don't have this conversation at the table. Eat. Now." Auntie Stephanie would have given me a reason. The name landed like a grenade. Taewoo's joy tightened. "Stephanie doesn't work here anymore." "We know." This came from Soli, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible in the silence. "You fired her." "That's not your concern." "Yes, it is." Irene set down her chopsticks with careful precision. "She took care of us. That makes it our concern." Taewoo felt his control over the situation slipping, felt the eyes of his associates watching to see how he would handle this challenge to his authority from his own children. He could shut this down. Should shut this down. A sharp word, a dismissal, a reminder of who was in charge. But before he could speak, Miro said something that changed everything. You fired the only adult who wasn't afraid of you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Juno coughed. Someone's glass clinked against a plate. The politician suddenly found his napkin fascinating. But no one spoke. Taewoo stared at his daughter, this small child in a navy dress who had somehow identified the exact thing he'd been avoiding thinking about for 2 weeks. Stephanie hadn't feared him. Not his reputation, not his power, not his anger. She had respected him, yes, but she had never been afraid. And that had been intolerable. That's enough. His voice was cold. Mrs. Park, take the children upstairs. No. Soli's whisper cut through his command like a blade. She was the only one who told us when something was wrong. Even when you lied. I don't lie to you. You told us those men at your meetings were business partners. Auntie Stephanie told us they were dangerous and we should stay away. 2 weeks later, one of them got arrested for murder. Soli's eyes were too old, too knowing. You lied. She told the truth. And you fired her for it. Taewoo felt something crack inside his chest, but his face remained stone. Mrs. Park, I said take them upstairs. But Mrs. Park wasn't moving, frozen by the weight of whatever was happening at this table. And Iron, the quietest and most calculating of his daughters, chose that moment to deliver the final blow. She taught us how to tell the difference between what's right and what's powerful. That's why you sent her away. The silence that followed was absolute. Taewoo looked at his daughter, this 7-year-old child who had just dismantled the foundation of everything he'd built his life on, and found he had no response. What could he say? That power and righteousness were the same? That authority justified itself? That the strong made the rules and the weak followed them? He had believed all of that. Had built an empire on those beliefs. But looking at Iron's face, seeing the disappointment in Soli's eyes, witnessing Miru's barely contained fury, he realized that his daughters had learned a different lesson entirely. They had learned that their father valued control more than truth. That he would sacrifice integrity for convenience. That when faced with someone who challenged him with moral clarity instead of violence, he had chosen to destroy rather than listen. Upstairs. Now. This time Mrs. Park moved, ushering the 3 girls away from the table. They went without protest, but as they passed their father's chair, none of them looked at him. That absence of eye contact felt like a punishment worse than any argument. The dinner resumed, but the energy had changed. Conversations felt forced. Juno made some joke about children being difficult. The politician mentioned his own teenage son's rebellion. But everyone at that table knew they had witnessed something more significant than a child's tantrum. They had seen Kang Taewoo, the most feared man in Seoul's underworld, lose a fight to 3 7-year-olds. Later that night, Taewoo stood in his office on the 2nd floor, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. Through the window, he could see the lights of Seoul spreading out below him like a constellation of captured stars. He owned significant pieces of this city, had clawed his way up from nothing to command respect, fear, and power. But he couldn't command his own daughters. The door opened without a knock. Only one person in this house had that privilege. You look terrible. His mother, Kim Yuna, closed the door behind her and settled into the leather chair across from his desk. At 73, she was still formidable, steel-spined and sharp-eyed, the woman who had raised him alone after his father's death and taught him everything about survival. It's late, Mother. I know. I was at dinner. Everyone knows. She studied him with the same expression she'd used when he was 7 and had lied about breaking her favorite vase. Those girls humiliated you tonight. They're children. They don't understand. They understand perfectly. That's your problem. Yuna leaned forward. Tell me, what did that woman do that was so terrible you had to fire her? She questioned my judgment in front of the children. And was she wrong? Taewoo's fingers tightened around his glass. That's not the point. Then what is the point? That you're the boss? That your word is law? Yuna's voice softened. Taewoo, I raised you to be strong. To never show weakness. To lead. But I never taught you to confuse obedience with respect. She disrespected me. No. She disagreed with you. Those aren't the same thing. His mother stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the same city lights her son had been staring at. I met her, you know. The Nigerian woman. She came to me 3 months ago, asked if there were any dietary restrictions for the girls she should know about. Do you know what I told her? Taewoo said nothing. I told her Soli has a sensitive stomach, that Miru won't eat anything green unless you mix it with rice, that Iron likes her food exactly room temperature. And do you know what she did? She thanked me, wrote everything down, and then spent the next 3 months making sure those girls ate properly. She cared for them. Not because she was paid to, Mrs. Park is paid to, and those children look at her like she's furniture. She cared because she chose to. Mother, you fired her because she made you feel small. Because she stood in your house, in front of your children, and showed them that power without principle is just bullying with better clothes. Yuna turned from the window, and her expression was harder than Taewoo had seen in years. Those girls don't fear you anymore. And that's not Stephanie's fault. That's yours. She left without waiting for a response. Taewoo drank his whiskey, then poured another, then sat in the dark and forced himself to face the question he'd been avoiding since that dinner ended. What had he actually taught his daughters tonight? Not respect for authority. Not the importance of hierarchy. He taught them that truth was dangerous, that speaking up had consequences, that the strong punish the honest. He taught them to fear integrity. The realization settled over him like ash. This was how it started, wasn't it? This was how good men became monsters, one small compromise at a time, one silenced voice, one fired employee who dared to care more about children than career. His phone buzzed. A message from Juno, new hire starts Monday. Comes highly recommended. Taewoo stared at the message for a long time. Then he did something he rarely did. He called a contact in the city's employment sector, a woman who owed him favors and asked no questions. I need you to find someone for me. 3 days later, Taewoo had an address. Stephanie lived in a narrow building in Yeongdeungpo, the kind of neighborhood where immigrants clustered together for safety and familiarity. Her apartment was on the 4th floor, accessible only by stairs. Taewoo climbed them slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The door opened 6 inches, held by a chain lock. Stephanie's face appeared in the gap, and for the first time since he'd known her, Taewoo saw genuine surprise in her expression. Mr. Kang. Miss Okafor. May I speak with you? No. The word was polite but absolute. It's about the children. Are they hurt? No. Then there's nothing to discuss. She started to close the door. Please. The word felt foreign in his mouth. Kang Taewoo did not beg, did not plead, but he said it anyway. 5 minutes. Stephanie studied him through the gap in the door. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her he was sincere, because she released the chain and opened the door fully. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchenette, bathroom, and a sleeping area separated by a curtain. But it was immaculate. A small cross on the wall. Books stacked neatly. The smell of something cooking on the hot plate. And on the small table, Taewoo saw 3 leather bracelets in different colors, clearly in progress. She was making more for the girls. I'm not coming back. Stephanie didn't offer him tea, didn't invite him to sit. She stood with her arms crossed, blocking the entrance to her home. If that's why you're here, you wasted your time. I know. That seemed to surprise her more than his appearance had. Then why are you here? Taewoo had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times on the drive over. He'd planned what to say, how to frame it, how to maintain dignity while admitting error. But standing in this tiny apartment, looking at the woman his daughters loved and he had dismissed, all those prepared words felt hollow. They told me the truth at dinner last night. In front of 20 people. They made me look foolish. Good. The response was so blunt, so devoid of the fear or deference he was used to, that Taewoo almost smiled. You don't respect me at all, do you? I respect what you could be. I have 0 respect for what you are right now. Stephanie moved to the small kitchen area and poured herself tea. She did not pour him any. You run an empire on fear and violence. You keep your children close to that violence because you think it will make them strong. And when someone tells you that maybe, just maybe, children shouldn't watch men with guns get drunk and discuss territory like it's a game, you fire them. Not because they're wrong, because they're right, and that threatens you. You have no idea what my life requires. You're right. I don't. I've never killed anyone. Never ordered someone hurt. Never built power on other people's fear. She sipped her tea. But I know what children require. They need adults who tell them the truth. Who show them that strength and morality aren't opposites. Who teach them that respect is earned, not demanded. And you weren't giving them that. So you decided to? I decided to treat them like human beings instead of accessories to your empire. Apparently, that was too radical. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them less like anger and more like two people finally being honest after months of performing roles. They're refusing to eat unless you're there. They've driven Mrs. Park to tears. Soli won't sleep without the bracelet you made her. Taewoo's voice remained steady, but something underneath it had cracked. My mother says I taught them to fear integrity. That I punished you for caring. She's right, isn't she? Stephanie set down her tea. Why are you really here, Mr. Kang? Because I need to offer you something. Not your old position. A new one. I'm not interested in being your maid. I know. I'm offering you the position of children's guardian. Full autonomy over their care, education, and safety. Authority to override any instruction from me or my staff if you believe it compromises their well-being. Salary triple what I paid you before. Separate quarters in the West Wing, not the servants' floor. And a formal contract that requires my written justification if I ever want to terminate your employment. Stephanie stared at him. You're serious. Completely. Why? Because my daughters are 7 years old and already smarter than most of my associates. Because they saw through my bullshit in one dinner when it took my mother 70 years to call me on it. Because they need someone who will teach them that power without principle is just tyranny with better suits. He met her eyes fully. Because they need you. And apparently, so do I. I don't need you, Mr. Kang. I was fine before I worked for you. I'll be fine after. I know. That's why I'm here. Stephanie walked to the window and looked out at the narrow street below. Taewoo waited, understanding that this moment required patience. She wasn't considering his offer. She was deciding whether he deserved the effort of rehabilitation. Finally, she turned back. I have conditions. Name them. The children never attend your business dinners again. Ever. They can meet your associates in controlled settings during the day, with me present. But they do not watch you negotiate violence over wine. Agreed. I have full authority over their education. If I say they need something, you provide it. No questions, no vetoes. Agreed. And you attend one family dinner every week. No phones, no business, no interruptions. Just you and your daughters. I'll be there the first month to facilitate, but the goal is for you to actually know your children. That one made him hesitate. I'm not good at that. I know. That's why you're going to practice. Her expression softened slightly. Mr. Kang, those girls don't need a boss. They have plenty of people who fear you. What they need is a father. Someone who listens more than commands. Someone who admits when he's wrong. Can you be that person? Taewoo thought about the dinner. About Miru's anger, Soli's disappointment, Iron's devastating assessment of his character. About his mother's words. About the empire he'd built and the family he was losing. I don't know, but I want to try. Stephanie studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. I'll need 2 weeks to settle things here. And Mr. Kang? If you ever fire me again out of ego or pride or because I challenge you, I walk away permanently. No second chances. Understood. Understood. Then we have a deal. They shook hands, a formal gesture that felt more binding than any contract. As Taewoo left the apartment and descended the stairs, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not relief, exactly. Not victory. Something more uncomfortable and more necessary. Accountability. 2 weeks later, Stephanie returned to the mansion. The triplets were waiting in the foyer when she arrived, all 3 of them trying and failing to maintain dignified composure. The moment she set down her bags, they rushed her, wrapping small arms around her legs and waist and whatever parts of her they could reach. You came back. Miru's voice was muffled against Stephanie's stomach. I did. Father said you're in charge of us now. Soli looked up with those two knowing eyes. That we have to listen to you more than anyone. Even him. Is that true? Iron asked. It's true. Stephanie smoothed down their hair, adjusted their collars, took in the sight of 3 children who looked healthier just from having her back. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you run wild. Rules still apply. Respect still matters. But from now on, if something feels wrong, if an adult tells you to do something that doesn't make sense, you come to me first. Deal? Deal. All 3 of them spoke at once. Taewoo watched from the top of the stairs, observing this reunion that he had no place in. His daughters hadn't greeted him that warmly in weeks. Stephanie saw him watching and gave him a small nod, not submission, not deference, but acknowledgement. An equal recognizing another equal. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. That night, at the first mandated family dinner, Taewoo sat at a table with only 4 other chairs. No associates. No security. No buffer between him and the reality of his family. Mrs. Park served the meal and then disappeared, leaving them alone. Stephanie had cooked. He recognized none of the dishes, some Nigerian cuisine she'd promised the girls they would try together. The triplets dug in with enthusiasm they hadn't shown for food in weeks. Taewoo picked up his fork and looked at the strange stew on his plate. It's called a gussie soup, made with melon seeds and spinach. Try it. Stephanie's voice was neutral, but her eyes held a challenge. He tried it. It was good. Different, but good. The girls tell me you've never asked them about their day. Not once. Stephanie wasn't eating yet, just watching him. Why is that? I assumed they'd tell me if something important happened. Children don't work that way. They need prompting. Practice. She turned to Iron. Tell your father about the book you're reading. Iron, who had barely spoken to him in 2 weeks, looked startled. But Stephanie's presence seemed to give her permission, and slowly, haltingly, she began describing a novel about a girl who solves crimes. Taewoo listened. Asked a question. Got an animated response. Then Soli talked about a drawing she'd made. Then Miru described a game she'd invented that made absolutely no sense, but clearly delighted her. And Taewoo sat there, eating Nigerian food he'd never heard of, learning about his daughter's inner lives for what felt like the first time, and realized that this simple dinner with no agenda and no power plays, was harder than any negotiation he'd ever conducted. But it was also the first time in months that his children looked happy. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the Kang household. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, like water wearing down stone. Stephanie established routines. Morning lessons, afternoon activities, evening stories. She taught the girls about different cultures, different ways of seeing the world. She taught them critical thinking, how to question without being disrespectful, how to analyze power structures, how to stand firm in their convictions while remaining kind. And slowly, grudgingly, she began teaching Taewoo too. They're children, not soldiers, she said one afternoon when he suggested the girls should learn to handle firearms before age 10. Let them have a childhood first. Time enough for darkness later. This world doesn't wait for them to be ready. Then you change the world they're growing up in. That's what fathers do. He had no response to that. 3 months later, at one of the weekly dinners, Miru asked him a question that should have been simple. Father, do you think what you do is right? Taewoo looked at his daughter, at Stephanie watching carefully from the other end of the table, at his own hands that had done things he could never wash away. No, I don't think it's right. But I think it's necessary. Why? Because someone has to control the chaos. Better me than someone worse. But what if you're already someone worse? Iron's question was asked with genuine curiosity, not cruelty. What if you're the reason someone else thinks they need to be bad too? The question hung in the air like smoke. Taewoo had spent his entire adult life justifying his choices, explaining away the violence, the fear, the careful calculus of power that required breaking people before they broke you. But sitting at this table, looking at 3 children who saw through every rationalization, he couldn't find the words. I don't know, he said finally. I honestly don't know. Stephanie spoke quietly. That's the first honest thing I've heard you say. That night, after the girls were in bed, Taewoo found Stephanie in the library, reviewing educational materials for next month's lessons. He knocked on the door frame even though it was his house. "May I come in?" She looked up surprised. "It's your library. But it's your time." He entered anyway, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me what I was becoming. What I'd already become." He looked at his hands. "My mother spent my whole childhood trying to make me strong. She succeeded. But no one taught me the difference between strength and cruelty. Your daughters are teaching you now. They learned it from you. They learned it from watching what happens when someone stands up to power without violence. When someone says no without raising their voice." Stephanie set down her pen. "Mr. Kang, you asked me once why I don't respect you. Want to know when that will change?" "When?" "When you look at those girls and realize that the empire you built means nothing if they grow up to fear you instead of love you. When you understand that real power isn't making people obey. It's making them want to be better because you showed them how." She met his eyes. "Your daughters don't need you to be feared, Mr. Kang. They need you to be good. That's harder. That's scarier. But that's what matters." Taewoo left the library without responding. But as he climbed the stairs to his own quarters, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible 4 months ago. He was going to try. 6 months after Stephanie returned, Taewoo attended his first school event. The triplets were performing in a small play about Korean folktales, and Stephanie had mentioned it at dinner. He'd assumed she'd handle it. She'd looked at him with that expression that meant he was missing the point. "They want you there. Not me. You." So he went. He sat in a tiny auditorium with other parents, feeling absurdly out of place in his tailored suit surrounded by casual clothes and friendly chatter. When his daughters came on stage, Iron narrating, solely playing a princess, Miro somehow cast as a tiger, he watched them with something like wonder. They were good. They were confident. They were happy. And when the play ended and they ran off stage to find him, when they grabbed his hands and pulled him towards Stephanie waiting in the back with a camera and a smile, when Miro shouted, "Did you see me, father? Did you see?" with such pure joy that it physically hurt. That was when Kang Taewoo understood what he'd almost lost. Not his empire. Not his power. Not his reputation. His children. Later, much later, when the girls were older and the world had shifted in ways none of them could have predicted, Iron would write an essay for university about power and morality. In it, she would describe a moment at a dinner table when she was 7 years old, when she'd told her father that he'd fired someone for teaching the difference between right and powerful. That night, she wrote, "I learned that truth is a weapon the powerless can wield against the powerful. And my father learned that all his guns and money and men meant nothing if he'd lost the ability to hear that truth. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we underestimate. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit we were wrong." Soli became a social worker, dedicating her life to protecting children from the kind of environment she'd been raised in. Miru became a lawyer who specialized in cases involving discrimination and abuse of power. And all three of them remained close to Stephanie, the woman who'd taught them that dignity didn't require permission and strength didn't require cruelty. As for Taewoo, he never left his empire. But he changed how he ran it. Slowly. Imperfectly. With constant pushback from people who'd profited from the old way. But he changed. Because 3 7-year-old girls had taught him that power without accountability was just tyranny with better suits. And one Nigerian woman had shown him that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from someone who doesn't deserve your labor. And sometimes, if that person is willing to change, the strongest thing you can do is give them one more chance. Not because they earned it, but because mercy, like strength, is a choice. The story ends there in that small moment of hope and possibility. Because sometimes the most powerful endings aren't about resolution, but about potential. The idea that change is possible if we're willing to do the hard work of becoming better than we were. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever stood up to someone in power and paid the price? Or witnessed someone else do it? What happened? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We share stories about power, family, dignity, and the complicated ways people change every single week. Don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. Remember, respect is earned, not demanded. And sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths.